Well, thank you all for having me again. It's wonderful to see familiar faces and new faces, and any night where we get to have scotch and talk about Alexander Hamilton is a good night. My subject for tonight is a big one, and so I'm not going to come close to covering the entirety of it. Books could be written about it, but the title I thought that was going to be jazzy enough to get people in the room was Hamilton at War. I didn't, when I picked the title a while ago, I didn't anticipate that we would be involved in, or that the world would be seeing, a major land invasion. But I think it does raise the salience of some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. There are three ways to think about Hamilton at war, and I mean at, not and. The first is his combat experience, and I'll tell some stories about that I think elucidate important elements of his character. The second is to talk about the 4 years he spent on Washington's staff as his aide-de-camp and as a senior staff officer, despite being incredibly young, and a certain other set of his talents show through in that capacity. And then lastly, in most of these talks in the past, I've talked about the Federalist Papers or Hamilton's time as an attorney or his time as Secretary of Treasury. This will be a little different because I want to talk about how those experiences intersect with some of his ideas articulated later in his vision of war as part of statecraft. Because there's a prudence to Hamilton's ideas about war that is in many ways sorely missing in the present. The first thing to say about Hamilton and war is that it came to him when he was very young, but he was not. I won't say that he was eager for it, although in a letter he wrote shortly before leaving for the United States while still living in St. Croix, he said that he longed for a war as an opportunity for adventure, but he was about 17 then, so I think we can forgive him for not having a fully developed prefrontal cortex. It came to him early, and it came in a way that he could be said to have anticipated. As the conflict between the 13 colonies and Britain escalated, Hamilton joined the early patriot political movements and recognized, I think, about in line with many others, that war was a possibility. Both before and after the first shots were fired, he did a great deal of reading to try to, smarten himself up, if you will, about tactics, strategy, operations, etc. After Lexington and Concord, he helped form a body of militia with fellow students at what was then called King's College, that we now know as Columbia, and they began to drill and march and hold, artificial weapons and get sort of rudimentary infantry tactics, none of which, as far as we can tell, were particularly useful when the action actually kicked off here on Manhattan Island. Instead, what was useful was Hamilton and others in his unit showed tremendous bravery and commitment to the cause. South of here, down at the Battery, he and his militia company stormed a series of British land gun emplacements under fire from British ships in the water, coming around the Battery. Hence why it's called the Battery, and managed to take hold of the British cannon. At which point they were immediately turned into, you'd guessed it, an artillery unit. That's sort of how it went in the early days of the Revolution. Oh, you've taken some artillery captive. Congratulations, you're an artillery unit now. So that's how Hamilton found himself an artillery officer within the first 48 hours of the war. His militia company, they took on the name the Hearts of Oak, really an act of modesty there. Took the guns with them up Manhattan Island, and as the revolutionary forces retreated from New York, they saw action again at Harlem Heights and then at White Plains, a series of defeats that on the one hand were deeply traumatic to the early revolutionary movement, and on the other hand showed levels of tactical sophistication and courage at different points that surprised the British and frankly surprised Washington and other American military commanders, that not exactly irregular troops, but certainly not drilled in regulars yet, were capable of pulling off some fairly sophisticated maneuvers. Hamilton dragged the guns all the way to the New Jersey campaign, which means that at a certain point in time, they were crossing the Delaware in the middle of the night as well with cannons, which seems not a lot of fun. You've all seen the painting. Can you imagine doing that, but with cannons and the horses needed to drag them? At Trenton, during the ambush on the Christmas morning, Hamilton's guns were essential to pinning down Hessian forces in their barracks, so that they couldn't roll out and form into a line and meet the oncoming American assault. That was critical to the success, because obviously the Hessian forces, contrary to popular mythology, they were not drunk, they were not hungover, they had not had a great celebration the night before. Through a combination of good luck and terrible weather, the Americans were able to circumvent a few outlying sentry posts and surprise the main Hessian body. This was in the wake of considerable partisan warfare, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that Hamilton discusses. Finally, as the Americans moved on to Princeton, Hamilton's guns are essential to wrapping up the Battle of Princeton when he puts his 3 cannons in front of Nassau Hall, which if any of you are Princeton alums, I apologize. But they actually blew down the doors of Nassau Hall, which convinced the roughly 200 British regulars hiding in Nassau Hall to surrender. That was probably the last time that some guys from Columbia beat some guys from Princeton, but we'll leave it there. Certainly on their home court. Hamilton had already been noticed for his conspicuous bravery and his leadership capacity, and he was well known for his literacy and intellectual flair and capacity, and so he had turned down twice 2 opportunities to become a staff officer at this point, we think. We're not totally sure with whom, because the epistolary record leaves a bit to be desired, but we think maybe Nathaniel Greene was one of them. Finally, Washington comes calling and says, "I want you on my staff," and Hamilton, despite his desire to remain in the field and remain a frontline officer, realizes that he probably can't turn this one down. So he becomes a staff officer to Washington. To be blunt, Hamilton is the sort of quintessential American self-made man, and we can't discount ambition as part of that. I think he rightly recognized that in a revolution, the key is to be on the barricades. The leaders of the post-revolutionary future will have been the people who put their lives on the line, and while he had done that, he was reticent to let it go. The opportunity to lead, and frankly, the concomitant social advancement that came with being a staff officer to General Washington, let's not to put too fine a point on it, were appealing. And so he begins a period of very intense work as a staff officer. This is also when he meets the daughter of probably the wealthiest man in New York. A young woman named Elizabeth Schuyler begins to woo her and proposes to her, and they become engaged. He is, to put it bluntly, a young gun, and he's on the make, but also on the move, and has found a canvas on which to display the full range of his talents. And so that is an important thing to keep in mind. War is a canvas on which Hamilton can paint with the full range of his talents. All right, keep that in mind. Before I go on to his staff career, I want to talk a little bit about. He does see combat again at the end. So for 4 years, he works diligently on Washington's staff, works himself to the point of exhaustion, mental, physical, spiritual, emotional exhaustion, as was necessary. I mean, when you're working for George Washington, that's what you're going to do. He itches and aches to return to the field. Washington continues to demur for about 18 months, 12 months. Finally, in a slightly underhanded way, and not terribly subtle, Hamilton more or less conveys to Washington that he's going to quit the army if he's not allowed to return to the field. And so at the beginning of what will become the Yorktown campaign, he's given command of 400 American troops. Let me set the stage for the Yorktown campaign, because there's a certain symmetry of Hamilton's combat experience coming with the great American victories at the outset of the war and in the concluding action of the war. General Cornwallis had been down in coastal Carolina, attempting to suppress the American Revolution in the South, at that point under the command of Nathaniel Greene, and not having a great deal of success. He elects to march north up into the Hampton Roads area, into central Virginia, the area between Charlottesville and the coast, in the interest of raiding, but also to try to strike a new strategic blow at the heart of the revolution by capturing Richmond and some of the American leadership there. And he is successful in that. Once he gets to Virginia in the summer, he has 2 units of light cavalry under fellows whose names will go down in infamy in the United States, but who were in fact visionary light cavalry officers, a man named Bannister Tarleton and another named John Simcoe. Simcoe we'll hear more about in a bit. And they do a great job chasing two of the American immigrant commanders, Generals von Steuben and Lafayette, like Hamilton immigrants, but of a very different stripe. Lafayette, of course, is the source of Lafayette Square and any number of other honorifics. Von Steuben, who saved the Army from itself by being a great munitions officer, a quartermaster, and one of the early understanders of hygiene, is remembered primarily by being the namesake of Steubenville, Ohio. So you win some, you lose some. So anyway, you have Tarleton and you have Simcoe running around central Virginia. They destroy a number of American supply depots. They sort of come into light contact with Lafayette. Steuben sort of keeps distance and unfortunately leaves a large number of supplies on the north side of the York River and retreats. Those are burned. But it has the ironic effect of getting Cornwallis onto the Virginia Peninsula. This is not the intention, but that is what happens. Now, if you think about coastal Virginia, think about it as a hand sort of put on its side, or really this would be a little more accurate, with the arm of the Chesapeake opening up to cover it as a storm break. What that means is that the roads and the area around Hampton Roads, there are a lot of places where you can be cut off from the mainland. And Cornwallis marches himself down the Virginia Peninsula, which is bordered on by the York River on the north, the James River on the south, and of course the mouth of the Chesapeake on the east, from thence onto the ocean. And he's anticipating relief and resupply by sea, and does not realize how large three forces that are coming at him are. The first is the consolidated American forces marching down from New York. Washington, on August 14th, receives a letter from the second force, which is the French fleet coming up from the Caribbean under Admiral de Grasse. And Admiral de Grasse has with him the third force, which is 3,000 French regular troops. And so you have coming up from the Caribbean a massive French fleet. There is a small British fleet around Hampton Roads. There is also a larger British fleet under the command of who was that? Was that John Thomas Graves? Sorry, based here in New York. That fleet departs for Virginia because they hear rumors of a French fleet, the size and scale of which they do not anticipate. And then, of course, you have the American Army that also departs New York City on August 19th, marching, sort of mirroring where the British fleet is going, down into Philadelphia. At Philadelphia, they rendezvous with the French. They board transport boats and come down into southeastern Virginia. And so essentially, by August 19th, when the Americans arrive in Philadelphia, the stage is set for Cornwallis to be trapped. There's information, of course, that he doesn't have. He's not aware of any of these things going on, and so he continues to sit on the eastern end of the Virginia Peninsula at Yorktown. Once the French ships arrive on September 2nd and the Americans board, it's all over but the singing at this point, or more accurately, the shelling. De Grasse drops off his 3,000 French soldiers in Virginia, and on about the same time, and on September 5th, he and Graves engage one another in the Battle of the Chesapeake, which is at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, just east of the end of the Virginia Peninsula. The British do not anticipate the size of the French fleet. Because of some ambiguity around communication, essentially the ships at the front of the line see the size of the fleet, try to communicate it backwards, don't do a great job of communicating it. The Brits wind up stretched out, and the French fleet is victorious. On September 5th, Graves is forced to retreat back to New York, and all that remains of naval support for the English is a handful of ships that will serve as artillery support when the battle begins, but are essentially trapped inside the Chesapeake by the French fleet. At this point, Cornwallis becomes concerned. He's not a stupid man. He realizes that he's, in an exposed position. And so he sends, under Tarleton, he sends an infantry foraging party out on October 3rd, mirrored by the British cavalry. The British cavalry takes heavy casualties when they run into the Americans, who are much closer and in much greater numbers than anticipated. The foraging party retreats back, and I believe it's 2 days later on October 5th, after further reconnoitering, he sends a message to his senior commanders saying, I'm in real trouble here, guys. My position is not yet desperate, but very likely could be. By the end of the first week of October, most of the American forces are in position. They begin to dig a parallel trench to get close to the British lines in the fortifications surrounding Yorktown, so that they can begin to shell Yorktown with mortars. There's an exchange of shots, but not a whole lot has happened yet. Not a great deal of shelling of the city, and not a great deal of retaliation against the Americans. Once the first parallel gets close to Yorktown, and to think about it this way, Yorktown is essentially an inverted crescent moon facing the water with fortifications around it. There are redoubts, which are extended fortifications on the left side bordering the water, and on the right side, that would be the west and the east roughly. I mean, it's at an angle, but we'll call it the west and the east. And the westerly redoubts retreat quickly after the foraging party, which means that, in effect, Cornwallis has ships in the water that can defend him from being shelled to sea, and he has the easterly redoubts that prevent Americans who have gone around and been dropped on the eastern end of the peninsula from getting close enough to install mortars and begin to shell him. And this is where Alexander Hamilton re-enters history. There are two redoubts, Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10, on the eastern end of Yorktown. Both of these are held by British regulars. Both of these are heavily entrenched. These are gnarly, porcupine-looking things. You have you have deep trenches. You have pointy sort of tree trunks that have been stuck into the earthworks. Picture World War I, and you're not going to be that far off. All right, these are highly unpleasant places, and the British regulars there are there for one reason only, which is to hold the ground or die, because if the Americans take it, then the Americans will be able to put guns there, and if the Americans can put guns there, then the entire British army inside Yorktown will fall. And so Hamilton gets a fairly stark assignment. His job is to take his 400 regulars and assault Redoubt number 10 at nightfall. A French unit of roughly equivalent numbers will take Redoubt number 9. 9 is further inland, 10 is closer to the water, and if you go to Yorktown today, actually a fair amount of 10 has washed away into the water. So they've done a reconstruction, but with the changing of the tides and coastal patterns, a fair amount of it is eroded in the intervening quarter of a millennium. So Hamilton does exactly as he's ordered. His men fix bayonets, and with hatchets and bayonets on the tip of their muskets, they charge over open ground and into the trench as soon as night falls. They maintain the element of surprise until they're chopping down some of the earthworks with hatchets. The Brits open fire, and Hamilton and his men go over the top, and there's hand-to-hand fighting at the top of the parapet. And what's quite shocking and speaks to, I think, the state of British morale is, despite the intensity of the combat, they fold fairly quickly. Of the 400 men, 9 are killed immediately, 26 of them are wounded, some of them grievously. We don't know the exact count of how many of them die afterwards. And so Hamilton loses, in effect, 1 in every 10 men under his command taking this. The element of bodily danger cannot be overstated here. I mean, this is truly as hard as it gets. And this is what he'd asked for. This is what he'd wanted. And he gets it. Redoubt number 10 is overnight. They begin to drag American guns up. And so, quite ironically, Hamilton ends his war as an infantry commander, clearing the way for guns, a war that he began as an accidental artillery commander, clearing the way for infantry, in both cases demonstrating tremendous physical courage that earns him the admiration of his soldiers and also his superiors. In the middle of this, though, is a critical 4 years of his life to understand him as a thinker, and that is his time on Washington's general staff. It can be tempting to see this as sort of blood and guts as bookends, and then a lot of book work in the middle, and that's not really accurate. Washington lived hard among his men. He spent all but, I think, 5 nights over the course of 7 years living in a tent. It's a big tent. It's a nice tent, but it's still a tent. He demanded a great deal of his officers. Many of them worked themselves to the point of exhaustion, Hamilton included. As a staff officer, I think this is an underrated period in his career because we begin to see him developing certain skills, not that are improvements of his innate talents. He's brilliant. He's an effective writer, but as he begins to work on the general staff, we see him mastering the art of tone shifting. So you can read his letters and dispatches from this period of time, and 5 letters written on the same day will all have totally different tones and different ways of approaching things. With sometimes it can be almost bracing. When you read his dispatches to officers who are considerably his senior, writing on behalf of Washington, he internalizes that. He's very direct, he's very clear. Occasionally there's even familiarity, and he's not above making jokes at the expense of other senior officers. When he's writing to politicians or legislatures, especially the New York Assembly, he can be almost beseeching and world-weary, attempting to sort of finagle and cajole them into opening the purse strings to improve the condition of the army. In this, if you've read Washington's letters, you begin to see a familiar pattern. Washington is teaching Hamilton the art of command by letter. And he begins to internalize that. You do, in the letters to his fiancée and to his extended family, or her family really, and some other of his personal acquaintances, he does let the guard down a little bit. And we see a bit more of his concern and his anxiety. But in general, Hamilton is not a person who is terribly psychologically vulnerable in the letters from this period of time. There is, however, one exception, and that is the John Andre affair surrounding the betrayal of the revolution by Benedict Arnold at West Point. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the broad outlines of this, so I'll go quickly through it. But in effect, Benedict Arnold, having decided that the Congress had violated his honor, defected to the British side. The British officer responsible for making sure that that happened was a charming, gregarious officer by the name of, a major by the name of John Andre. Andre was a poet and a musician, a seducer, really, truly sort of a Lothario par excellence, great at a party, and beloved. Andre is the person who's been assigned to go and retrieve Arnold, to bring him in from the cold, if you will. And he does manage to exfiltrate Arnold from West Point, but he fails to exfiltrate himself as well through a combination of really bad luck and some skullduggery. Andre is arrested, and Lafayette, Hamilton, and Washington are all together up in upstate New York at this time, near West Point. They convene in Fishkill and then later in West Point itself to try to decide how to respond. And Andre it is decided from the beginning by Hamilton. By Washington. He's resolute that Andre will be hanged. He'll be hanged as a spy. He is a gentleman, but he was not wearing a uniform, and he will be hanged as a spy. And in effect, it falls to Washington's senior staff to babysit Andre during the period of several days between his arrest and his hanging. And they spend huge amounts of time with him. And interestingly, this leads to a debate that will be used somewhat unfairly against Hamilton shortly after he dies, where the hanging of Andre is remembered in the 19th century as a revolutionary triumph. But at the time, many of the people involved feel horrible about it, and they think that they've committed some sort of crime against honor. Simcoe, the British officer, claims to have obtained a copy of a letter written by Hamilton. The way Simcoe phrases it, and we don't have the original letter, is a bit odd. This was not unusual. Letters and orders would be would be caught all the time. A lot of things were written in cipher at the time. Many of those were disposed of. We don't have them necessarily today. But Simcoe claims to have had a letter in Hamilton's hand indicating that the only way to save Andre would have been for the British to give up Arnold. It is unclear, based on Simcoe's phraseology, whether Hamilton was saying, we are prepared to make a trade, or whether this was essentially Hamilton saying there's no way to save Andre because the only way you could do it would be this thing that is impossible. It's not clear. Hamilton's detractors would later charge him with having tried to save Andre's life by getting Arnold back. Right, at a point years in the future when Arnold has been back, and the amputee Arnold is back in Britain living as a sort of miserable minor aristocrat and no longer a threat to the revolution, the desire to trade the great spy for Arnold seems like next to treachery. But at the time, there were a lot of people who would have made that trade, and Washington is resolute. Nathan Hale was hanged a spy, and Andre will hang a spy as well. That is ultimately what happens. At the same time, we get a fascinating moment in the history of Hamilton's writings, or maybe Hamilton's writings, we're not sure. The New York Packet, which had originally been a newspaper published here in Manhattan, had fled when the British arrived up to Fishkill, which of course, as you all know, is near West Point. Its publisher was publishing out of Fishkill and published a letter in 1780, right in the midst of the Andre affair, I think in between his arrest and hanging, if I remember the dates correctly, which is written under the pseudonym Publius, of course, the famous pseudonym that Hamilton and Madison, and to some extent Jay, will make famous in the Federalist Papers, and which Hamilton had used previous to the Federalist Papers as well. No one to that point had used Publius, and this letter is a one-off. It's florid, it's emotional, it's beseeching the Americans to stand down the British threat in the face of this treachery and not to be demoralized. It's a cri de coeur. And it doesn't really sound that much like Hamilton of the Federalist Papers. But it does kind of sound like Hamilton's Juvenilia on St. Croix, which is florid, elusive, and highly emotional. And let's be honest, he was in a deeply emotional state at this time. We know that. It shows up in his letters to his father-in-law. It shows up in his letters to his fiancée at the time. This is about as emotionally distraught as we see Hamilton get during his 4 years as a staffer. A person that had been considered a mentor to some, a rival to others, and a heroic battlefield leader during the Battle of Quebec has defected. They've defected to the other side. Real doubt about the capacity of the revolution to survive and persist exists. And so there is a great question about whether or not Hamilton wrote this letter. There are elements of his dispatches that show up in the Publius letter in 1780 in the Fishkill Packet. It is quite possible, given the sheer volume of correspondence flying out of Washington's camp after the Arnold treason, that someone who had simply received multiple letters from Hamilton wrote it. But at this point, it's probably at least even odds, if not a little better odds, that this is a lost Hamilton letter and the first use of the pseudonym Publius. And it's, it's really, it'll make you want to run through a wall. It's like a football coach firing up his team. Hamilton concludes, as I mentioned, his staffing work at the end of, as the war winds to its end and at the beginning of the Yorktown campaign. He will return to the military staff in a senior capacity one more time, and that's in 1799. Washington, as the Adams administration teeters in the wake of the fragmentation of the Federalist Party, Adams beseeches Washington to take command of the Army again and be commander-in-chief, or not commander-in-chief, but commander of the Army. Washington says, I'll take the job, but I'm not leaving Mount Vernon unless the Army goes into the field in the event of a French invasion. And Adams says, well, then who should be in charge? And Washington says, you shouldn't ask me that because the answer is Alexander Hamilton. Adams is not happy about this because Hamilton and Adams have fallen out. Adams is beset by a group of hardline Federalists that, while they have a certain ambivalence about Hamilton, because of some elements of his personal life that have become public recently, they nonetheless see him as a sort of intellectual and spiritual guide, if you will. And so Washington's insistence that Hamilton take over is not well received by the Adams administration, but ultimately they relent. Little do they know, and little does Washington know, that he's about to catch pneumonia and die. And so he dies at the end of 1799, and at the moment he dies, Hamilton becomes the commander of the American Army. At this point, they're sort of shuttling between New Jersey and West Virginia, or I have that, what is now West Virginia, then Virginia. he finds the state of the Army in some disrepair, and so to read his letters from this period of his life is to see an even more economized and truncated vision of Hamilton's style, right? If he begins life as with this sort of flora juvenilia, and in his first 4 years on Washington's staff learns to sort of reaches the apex of his expressive capacity, which he will then use as a controversialist during the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debates of the Constitution. In this, we see an almost bureaucratic, technical Hamilton. But what's very interesting is he believes that war with France is inevitable, and he begins to prepare the army to Florida. The Spanish are allied with the French, and he sees the possibility of taking Spanish Florida as a real strategic boon. One thing that this reveals is that even in late 1799, Hamilton is still an Atlanticist in his mentality. I can't remember the letter. I should have written this down. But in one letter, I think to Benjamin Rush, he says, we are faced with Spanish Florida to our right and British Canada to our left. Right? If I were to say what's left of the United States to most of you, you would say the Pacific Ocean, and to the right, the Atlantic Ocean. Hamilton is looking out to the Atlantic Ocean. Florida is on his right hand. Canada is on his left hand. He remains that way, and this is ultimately Adams figures things out with the French, and we don't wind up invading Spanish Florida until a fellow named Jackson comes along. But this I think is a good point of departure to talk a little bit about what war is in Hamilton's mind. When you dig through his writings, especially from the period before 1800, what emerges is a series of examples and searching about for a good analog for the American colonies. And he doesn't straight up say we should be like country X, but he does say, consider the wisdom of this country's actions or the unwisdom of this one. And the country that he seems to think best fits into what the United States is facing is, of course, the obvious choice, the Dutch. I know that was definitely what you were going to say. What that I think, the Dutch, he sees the Dutch as having done a good job handling war in a few ways. First, they're very well armed and they're ready for it where necessary. Second, they're very good at making money off of it when other people fight it. And third, they are surrounded by belligerent neighbors who can overawe them in terms of raw force, and thus part of their survival has hinged on not getting into existential conflicts with their neighbors, including the Spanish Netherlands to the south, what is now Belgium. And so Belgium, of course, the Spanish called the Spanish Netherlands, heavily Catholic. The Dutch, both the Walloons and the anyway, it's Holland. There are Protestant, and much of the fallout of the 30 Years' War continues to play out in Holland through the 17th and 18th century. So why the Dutch? Well, there are a couple of things. They're federalized, they're internally fractious. You could see the stadtholder model as something that Hamilton would admire as a version of a republic. Obviously, the Dutch have cultural currency because of the Dutch have certain cultural currency because of the Glorious Revolution in 1688, which is the origin of the Bill of Rights in many respects. That's what Madison draws on to draft it. But I think there's also, it gets to the way in which Hamilton understands war as a function of state. The power of war and peace, he's very clear about, is a concomitant of sovereignty. If you're going to be sovereign, you're going to have the power of war and peace. Any entity that is given the power of war and peace is functionally sovereign. Anything that claims to be sovereign but lacks that power is not. He's very clear also that war is not really a money-making endeavor. In some ways, I think we over-imagine the break that Hamilton had with his contemporaries in terms of the concepts of economics that he was working with. He was very much a visionary, but he was a visionary working within fundamentally a mercantilist world. And although he was skeptical of a lot of elements of mercantilist theory, he was not, he was not a Ricardian, right? Hamilton is not working in a world of 21st century economics, but he sounds almost like Rousseau at times when he talks about the expense foisted upon governments by war making without clear ends. Nonetheless, Hamilton is not a peacenik. He believes the capacity to make war is necessary and the doing of it will be inevitable. And this is why he pushes really quite hard against one of the hardest held and longest held American cultural inheritances from the mother country, especially England, not so much Scotland. Hamilton being a Scot, he would not have the sort of sentimental attachment to that, which is the hostility to a standing army. Hamilton hates this hostility. He sees it as provincial, as unmodern, and as benighted. He wants a standing and professionalized army with a professional officer class. Interestingly, not because he's an elitist in the way one might think. Hamilton does have a lot of elitism to him, but he does not believe that the training of staff officers in Europe makes for officers of a superior rank. In fact, a letter from, I want to say 1779, he's very clear that American officers are more than capable of doing the job despite their limited training, but that part of professionalizing an army as an institution is having an officer corps. All right, so this is not snobbery, this is pragmatism still, his sort of overwhelming pragmatism. Ultimately, though, we don't have a definitive statement from Hamilton on his theory of military affairs. Right? We have the reports on public credit, we have writings on infrastructure, we have even a proposal on the exchange of prisoners with the British that has a lot of material in it for international lawyers and their interpretations of things. We don't have the equivalent of Machiavelli's On War or Sun Tzu's On War in Hamilton's hand. But taken in the aggregate, and this will be a controversial claim, and I may even be completely wrong about it, but he comes out with a vision of war as simultaneously, almost fatalistically, as inevitable. He's unashamed about the needfulness of the young country being able to make war. He's blunt about the fiscal distortions that war-making causes. One of his early arguments against Parliament is that the British are so invested in making continental war that they will draw more and more and more wealth out of their colonies for the purposes of this. And at the same time, urgent in his insistence that the United States professionalize. Given what happens a decade after his death, I think you could say that he's quite thoughtful, and he has a lot of foresight about that. In the War of 1812, the United States does not have a meaningful standing army. They do not have a fully professionalized officer corps, and the first 18 months of the war go very poorly. In no small part because Madison is convinced that, very much in contrast to Hamilton's view, that America being Britain's food source will prevent Britain from invading the United States. Hamilton, had he been around, would have been quite explicit, but one can anticipate what he would have said based on his writings, which is they'll just go buy it elsewhere. And so I think ultimately to take Hamilton's experience and vision of war in the aggregate is to see a voice of martial realism and prudent restraint. And that, I think, is a voice that would be very much useful in days such as these. So thank you all very much, and I'll take any questions.